Good afternoon, YouTube. This is Jim, the Budget Audiophile, signing on for the first time. Today, I want to talk about biamping your speakers as well as your speaker interconnects, your speaker wire. So without further ado, let's go and take a look at the back of my speakers. Now, I own PSB Stratus bronzes. Let's get the budget spotlight in place. There we go. So this is typical of better quality speakers. They're biampable, so they have two sets of speaker jacks on them, and people just starting out or on a budget might just run a simple zip cord with a negative and a positive and a pair of inexpensive banana plugs, and in my case that's how I set them up initially, and the sound quality was just, it wasn't there at all. It was awful. So let's take them apart and set them up in a biamp configuration. So you have to take the jump straps off, the negative. There's one on the positive as well. Let me just get the light on that so you can see it. There you go. It's just a simple copper or brass strap with gold plating. If you happen to have bought these used, they may well have had a homemade jumper like this installed, and you just take these both off as well. So in biamping, you're going to have two amplifier channels for each speaker and two sets of speaker wire. So that's the configuration I started out with, and I was using the better quality speaker wire that you'll see in a minute, but I just happen to have the zip cord handy to show you. So I set it up like this, and I had high hopes that I would have a big improvement in sound, and after some critical listening to known records, I had to conclude that there was no change whatsoever. I was really disappointed. So I slept on it, and I woke up a couple of days later with a thought, and that was that maybe I needed more copper in the circuit. So let me show you the final configuration that brought my tweeters alive and made a huge improvement. So red to red, positive to positive, black to black, and let's just take a look at the last wire here. Let's see if I can get the camera on it so you can see it. So this is the speaker terminals I like to use. These are called BFAs, and they're made by Nakamichi. Years ago, Lynn used these as interconnects, so that speaks highly of them. And the two things I like about these a lot is that that there's a large surface area here for contact, and there's no moving parts. And if they get a little bit loose, you just put a small slot screwdriver in here and just wedge it open slightly, and they'll tighten right up. So let's connect that up. So that's what my final configuration looked like, and you've probably noticed that this is a two-conductor wire, and it's feeding each side. So we've got a large increase in copper in here, and let's go back to the chair and I'll tell you exactly how I did that. Camera set up, grab my prop. Now before I tell you exactly how to biamp and how to wire up your speakers that way, let me talk to you a little bit about why I thought I needed to make some changes. When I bought the PSB Stratus bronzes, they had very well reviewed tweeters. In fact, the reason I bought them is that the whole line, the bronzes, the silvers, and the golds are very well reviewed speakers. People love them, in particular tweeters. And what I discovered was that the whole line uses the same tweeter. And I thought, great, I can have some beautiful aluminum dome tweeters. I can afford these speakers. I figured I'd have to make some modifications, probably swap out some of the woofers. And I was under no illusion that they were going to sound initially as good as the golds, the top of the line, but I had hopes that I could bring them up to that standard or close. So I got them home, I connected them up, and played reference music in which I had various parts of the spectrum, the high end for the tweeters, the mid-range for the mid-woofer, and the low end. And when I got cymbal strikes, all I could hear was this tick, tick, tick. And it was disappointing. And in fact, I was ticked off. And that actually started me on this whole path towards making changes, modding, documenting what I've got in my system, always reviewing where there might be a weak link, where I could make improvements. And that leads us to the story of how to buy amp and how to wire your speakers so that you can improve your sound quality. So buy amping is quite simple. If you have a good quality AV receiver, you're going to have 2 rear surround channels that are assignable. And you can go into your menu options for your receiver and you can designate them as buy amp fronts. And if you don't have that option, you probably have an A set of speakers, your normal fronts, and a B set, which were meant for another room. And if the amplifier driving the B side, you have to check your specifications, but in many cases the B side speakers have the same amplifier section as the A's. So what you do is you select the A's and the B's together, and now you've got 4 channels running simultaneously with the same music, and now you've got 4 amplifiers to buy amp your speakers. If you happen to have an integrated amplifier or an older receiver, you probably have the AB option as well. So that's how we buy amp at the receiver or at the amplifier. So how did I wire these things? Well, to increase the copper, I went into my bag of miscellaneous parts, and in one of my deals I had bought some audio equipment, and it came with a whole bunch of speaker wire. So what is this? This is 14 tubes, 99.9% pure copper, oxygen free. So it's decent speaker wire. It was made for in-wall, so it's got a nice heavy jacket on it. And there's no reason why this couldn't be used outside the wall. So 14 gauge, what is that? Well, 14 gauge is the thickness of the conductor. 16 gauge is smaller. 12 gauge is larger or heavier. 14.2, the 2 stands for 2 conductors inside. So this is decent wire. And initially I had 14 gauge on a single feed to the negative and to the positive. And when I decided I wanted more copper, I decided what couldn't be better. I twisted together my 2 14 gauge strands. They fit snugly into my BFA connectors. They also fit snugly into banana plugs, so that's good. Snug fit is good. You want a nice clean strip, of course. And effectively, 2 14 gauge wires gives you 11 gauge. So that's wonderful. So now I've doubled the amount of copper, and I've done more than just that. Instead of having the 2 conductors inside one jacket, I now have a positive and a negative and another positive and negative all inside their own jacket. So I don't have the plus and minus signals sitting right next to each other. I've separated them a bit, and I've doubled the amplification and quadrupled the amount of copper from a standard zip cord feed. So I had started with 130 watts times 2, so that's 260 watts. So I now have 520 watts feeding my fronts. And what was the result of this change? Well, it was immediate, it was obvious. I didn't have to do very much critical listening before I realized that I had instant success. The high frequency spectrum returned in full. It was beautiful, it was glorious. It was audio nirvana. It was a musical orgasm. It was that good. And that success led me to try all kinds of changes and mods. And in future episodes, I want to talk about many of those. And it also led me to believe that for very little bit of money, a budget audiophile could make significant improvements. So, at the end of each episode, I want to talk about a favorite album, and I've got a very appropriate record to talk about. This is Santana Abraxas. See if we can get some nice light on that for you. This is Santana's second album, released in 1970. This is the original Canadian release. And the song that I really love on this is the opening track called Singing Winds, Crying Beasts by Michael Carabeo. And it's filled with beautiful high-frequency sounds. It's got chimes, it's got triangles, it's got cymbals, it's got bells. And many of you might not know that the original Santana lineup that was on this album had 3 percussionists. And I can just imagine when they were recording this, that all 3 of these guys were hammering away on their bells and their triangles, well, not hammering, tapping, and producing just this gorgeous soundscape. So I use this first track as one of my reference tracks to check out the high end, my tweeters. But the entire album is just this gorgeous mix of rock, fusion, Latin, jazz fusion. And if Santana had only released this one record, I would say that this was probably one of the best records in that genre, in that progressive rock fusion, Latin fusion genre. I would say it was one of the best records ever. But this press that I'm holding is not so good. The music's lovely, the whole album's lovely, in fact, but the sound off of it is not that great. How did I know that? Because the first album I got was a quadraphonic press. And as you can see, it's got that beautiful artwork and a very distinctive gold band around it. All quad discs aren't like this, of course, but they usually prominently display quadraphonic on them. And to answer the questions that I can hear coming in right now, yes, you can play back a quadraphonic record with regular stereo equipment. In fact, most of the quad records say right on them that they're fine for stereo playback. You don't realize the full quad effect, of course. And quad is really quite interesting. Quad was designed as a further improvement to stereo, which was in itself a further improvement to mono. So what quad was a four-channel speaker system in which the speakers, let's put that treasure over here, the speakers were angled at 45 degrees to the listener. The listener sat dead in the middle of the X. The speakers were aimed straight at that person's ears, and you've got 4 channels of beautiful sound. The rear channels are not effect channels. They're supposed to be very much the same as the front channels. The signals are encoded differently, but the idea is that you're immersed in sound from all sides equally. So, what makes these quad records so much better? Well, I suspect that what we're looking at, this is from 1972, so 2 years later than the original Abraxas release, I think that we're looking at an early remaster. And the engineers and producers of this album, I suspect, realized that people who had invested in quad equipment, an extra 2 amplifiers, or an extra integrated amplifier, an extra 2 speakers back in the day was a big deal. And I think they figured that the people who had quad equipment had invested in good quality equipment. So when they made the quadraphonic press and remastered for quad, I think that they felt that they could expand the frequency of the press dramatically, so that we have more treble, more bass, a fuller mid-range. And let's face facts, back in the 60s and 70s, most people had shit systems, so they couldn't tell the difference between one master and one press. But those quad guys, I think I think they probably very much could tell the difference. So I seek out quad pressings whenever I can, because I've had similar results with other records that were quadraphonic. So they're well worth seeking out. I hope this has been helpful, and I've got more planned, and that's Jim, the Budget Audiophile, signing out for today.